does anyone know what a keystone species is? Okay. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a keystone species is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. So, for example, if this room was an ecosystem, and we were all different species, Dr. Rasmussen would be the keystone species for the class, and if she was gone, there wouldn't be a class anymore, right? We need stricter laws protecting keystone species. Many of these keystone species are also listed as endangered in their respective environments. And humans are mostly the reason why that they're endangered. Therefore, disincentives need to be put in place that are harsh enough that people will change their ways and allow the ecosystem to come back. With these laws, we can also preserve our biodiversity. There are currently 2,412 endangered species in the U.S., and many of them, even though it's not really possible to calculate, are keystone species, which is worth noting because having all of these keystone species as endangered is a big deal, because if they're endangered now and we're not doing anything to protect them and they go extinct, just think about how many other species will also go endangered when their ecosystem collapses. I mean, it's going to increase tenfold. It's crazy. In this speech, I want to talk about what protection laws we have currently and what new ones we need to effectively protect these organisms. To start off, what we have right now is the Endangered Species Act. It has done wonders in the past, but as you can see, by currently having 2,412 endangered species, it's not really still doing its job. It has pretty broad regulations to help conservation, which for the most part is a good thing, because there's so many differences between species that you can't have a specific cookie cutter regulation for all of them. It has to be pretty broad. But the problem with that is there's a lot of the Center for Conservation Innovation Director Jacob Malcolm says Section 7 of the Act requires all federal agencies to ensure the actions they fund, authorize, or carry out are not likely to jeopardize a species or destroy critical habitat, which sounds nice, but if you listen to the quote, it only talks about federal agencies in that act. It doesn't say anything about private companies. So it has to be the federal agencies regulating the private companies instead of having to wreck laws that regulate them. And while it does regulate private companies with regards to some regulations on, let's say, like toxic emissions and pollution output, things like that, it doesn't say anything to do with like habitat management or ecosystem conservation or anything like that. And if it does have any regulations, the punishments for it are so slim that private companies don't really even care what it says, because they just do it anyways and take the small slap on the wrist and keep going. So the most efficient way to fix this is to pass new revisions of the Act with clear regulations and punishments. So instead of just having regulations on federal agencies, there need to be regulations, direct regulations on private companies with punishments that will make them not want to break the rules, so that it will significantly harm their company if they don't follow those rules. And then the next thing I want to talk about is not fixing the Endangered Species Act, but creating new laws specifically for keystone species, not just endangered species. Which, again, is important because if these keystone species go extinct, I mean, not all of them, but even if one goes, the whole ecosystem, or any ecosystem that it is a keystone species of, will collapse, and then countless numbers of other species will be endangered now. And then the Endangered Species Act, being the only thing protecting them, won't do its job. As Octavio Alberto Oropeza says, hard name, he lives in Mexico, says, if efforts to conserve endangered species lack long-term visions and neglect human dimensions, conservation success will be questionable. And now he says endangered species, and that's, you know, a good conservation point, but he could also mean keystone species. It works both ways. Because a lot of times the only way legislation gets passed is if some extreme environmentalist group goes, I don't want to say goes crazy, but goes crazy. They, you know, want all of the endangered species to be protected and not just ones that we need protecting to help the biodiversity of the planet. So you have to think of it not just like, I mean, I care about protecting these species, and I know not everyone does, but you have to think about it for private companies. There has to be an incentive there for them to conserve these species, you know, so it can't be how a lot of environmentalist groups want it to be, where if you're hurting these species, you should just, your company should go bankrupt. You know, there has to be certain cash incentives for these companies where they're also making money to conserve these species. Otherwise, that's, you know, that's really the only way it's going to pass. After all, as Professor Merle Naidu of the University of Tokyo puts it, the primary motivations for companies to implement eco-friendly strategies are the expected economic benefits. Not everyone cares about the environment, which is fine. You just have to make an incentive for everybody else. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but I am majoring in environmental science, and I know how the conservation laws that I'm talking about will help these organisms and ecosystems. If keystone organisms aren't protected now, we'll have way more endangered species in the future. In conclusion, the Endangered Species Act did wonders, but now we need revisions, the ones I named, like having regulations for private companies and making cash incentives for those private companies are needed for it to still be effective. And we need new laws specifically protecting keystone species. Otherwise, no matter how much we fix the Endangered Species Act, we're still going to be going up in numbers on endangered species. We need to make laws now before it's too late.